charlatan, adventurer, helpless sport of superhuman forces, or chosen emissary of the spirit world. Commonplace is the last epithet that could justly be applied to spiritualist Daniel Dunglas Home. Whatever the explanation of the feats ascribed to him, they are more varied, more striking, and better attested than any others in the history of the marvelous. In Home and in his doings, all the problems of spiritualism are posed in their acutest form. On the marvels wrought by him, the main defenses of spiritualism must stand or fall. Daniel Dunglas Home was, by his own account, born near Edinburgh in 1833. When Home was 9 years old, he was taken by his adoptive family to America and lived with them until the end of 1850. Then the rapping epidemic, which had broken out in Hydesville 2 years previously, infected young Home, and he left his aunt's house and went out into the world. For the next 5 years, he stayed in one household or another in New York and elsewhere, giving seances and apparently receiving hospitality and some measure of education in return. In the autumn of 1855, he went to Italy and spent the next few years on the continent, courted, apparently for the whole period, on various friends, mostly persons of rank and wealth, and repaying the hospitality which he received by the exercise of his marvelous powers. In the autumn of 1859, he returned to England, bringing with him a young and charming wife, the daughter of a noble Russian family, and possessed of a moderate fortune. In 1862, his wife died, and Home, who appears to have been left in somewhat straitened circumstances, was forced to eke out his means by giving public lectures and recitations. He married for the second time, his wife again being a Russian lady possessed of some fortune. Home seems to have broken with nearly all his friends in this country, and to have exercised his mediumship more and more rarely. He spent the rest of his life mostly on the continent and died after a long and painful illness in June, 1886. This brief sketch of Home's career, founded as it is as regards the earlier years, mainly on material written or inspired by Home himself, needs a critical supplement. From the age of 17 onward, he lived by the exercise of his mediumship. Even if he never actually received payment in cash down throughout his life, first in the eastern states of America, and later in every country of Europe, he found wealthy patrons to welcome him to their homes and lavish their hospitality on him. There is no evidence of any weight that he was even privately detected in trickery. This unique immunity from the common lot of mediumship certainly calls for explanation. Mainly it was due to Home's peculiar position as a non-professional medium to the fact that his sitters were, in a sense, his guests, and that he himself selected those before whom he would consent to perform. We cannot exclude the possibility that there were cases in which imposture was actually detected by persons who refrained out of consideration for the feelings of their friends or from the fear of ridicule from making their discovery public. He appears to have won no special distinction as a medium. Raps were heard at his seances, tables and chairs were moved about the room, bells, accordions, and guitars were played under the table or even at a distance from the circle with no hand near them. Spirit voices would speak through the medium, and the medium himself would be levitated. But all these performances were the common property of the Spiritualist Guild, and apparently in the estimation of his contemporaries, Home was no more proficient than any other. His seances in England followed for the most part on the standards of the time. The room was commonly illuminated by one or more candles, a single gas burner or a shaded lamp. The manifestations would then usually begin with raps, followed shortly by a quivering movement of the table. The table would then tilt up, move about, or float suspended in the air. Musical instruments would perform in the convenient obscurity afforded by its shelter. Hands would be felt clasping the knees of the sitters and pulling portions of their clothes. Handkerchiefs, flowers and other light articles and even heavy bells would be handed about the circle. The performance would be interspersed with messages rapped out by the spirits, or delivered through the mouth of the entranced medium. At this point, the sitting would commonly terminate, but if conditions were judged favorable to the higher manifestations, the lights would be turned out, the fire screened, and the company gathered around the table. Hands would then be seen outlined against the faint light proceeding from the window to rise over the vacant edge of the table, move about the papers lying on its surface, or give flowers to the sitters. Afterwards, the medium would be levitated. In view of the mental condition of the sitters, and the fallibility of ordinary testimony on these matters, it is not difficult to guess how most of Home's manifestations were accomplished. It is to the experiments and observations made by the distinguished physicist, Sir William Crookes, that we must now turn our attention. In an article published in the Quarterly Journal of Science for July, 1870, Sir William announced that he had been for some time past engaged in investigating the manifestations commonly called spiritualistic. Though by no means prepared to accept the spiritualist hypothesis, he had seen enough to satisfy him of the occurrence of certain physical phenomena, not explicable by any physical law at present known, but he pointed out that the precautions hitherto taken against fraud, and the methods adopted for ascertaining the extent and the reality of the effects produced were alike. A year later, he was able to announce that he had succeeded in experimentally demonstrating the existence of a hitherto unknown force, and had measured the effects produced in justification of his claim. He gave a detailed description of one series of experiments conducted in his own laboratory in the presence of 4 other persons, 2 of whom attested the accuracy of his report based upon notes made at the time. The medium of the new force was Daniel Home. The apparatus employed in the chief experiment is thus described by Sir William. In another part of the room, an apparatus was fitted up for experimenting on the alterations in the weight of a body. It consisted of a mahogany board, 36 inches long by 9 inches wide and 1 inch thick. At each end, a strip of mahogany 1 inch wide was screwed on forming feet. One end of the board rested on a firm table while the other end was supported by a spring balance hanging from a substantial tripod stand. The balance was fitted with a self-registering index in such a manner that it would record the maximum weight indicated by the pointer. Before Home entered the room, the apparatus had been arranged in position, and he had not even the object of some parts explained before sitting down. After some preliminary experiments with an accordion, attention was turned to the apparatus. Mr. Home placed his finger lightly upon the extreme end of the mahogany board, furthest from the balance. Under these conditions, the index of the balance moved several times, the greatest downward pull registered being 6 pounds. It was particularly noticed that Home's fingers were not at any time advanced more than 1 inch from the extreme end of the board. That is not outside the point of support, so that it was physically impossible for any pressure of his fingers to have produced the downward movements of the board shown by the index. Moreover, his feet, as well as his hands, were closely guarded by all in the room. The few scientific men who ventured any public criticism on these experiments contented themselves for the most part with pointing out possible defects in the apparatus employed, or some source of error in the actual conduct of the experiment. The experiment described was not the first of the kind. It occurred in the middle of a long series. It has stated that Home was not familiar with the apparatus employed. But as similar apparatus had been employed at previous trials by Crookes himself, the statement carries little weight. The experiments I have tried have been very numerous, but to our imperfect knowledge of the conditions which favor or oppose the manifestations of this force, to the apparently capricious manner in which it is exerted, and to the fact that Mr. Home himself is subject to unaccountable ebbs and flows of the force, it has but seldom happened that a result obtained on one occasion could be subsequently confirmed and tested with apparatus specially contrived for the purpose. By the simple device of doing nothing when the conditions were unfavorable, he could ensure that the light was such and so placed, the apparatus so contrived and the sitters so disposed as to suit his purpose, and that in the actual experiment, the attention of the investigators would necessarily be concentrated on the wrong points. Under such conditions, as ordinary experience shows, 500 trained observers are no match for one clever conjurer. It seems possible to explain the great bulk of the marvels recorded of Home by a combination of trickery on the one side, and an unconscious misinterpretation on the other. The most noteworthy of all the cases of levitation is that which took place on December 16, 1868 at 5 Buckingham Gate, London, in the presence of Lord Lindsay, Viscount Adair and Adair's cousin, Captain Wynne. The fullest account is that of Lord Lindsay, written on July 14, 1871. During the sitting, Mr. Home went into a trance, and in that state was carried out of the window in the room next to where we were and was brought in our window. The distance between the windows was about 7 feet, 6 inches, and there was not the slightest foothold between them, nor was there more than a 12-inch projection to each window, which served as a ledge to put flowers. We heard the window in the next room lifted up, and almost immediately after we saw Home floating in the air outside our window. The moon was shining full into the room. My back was to the light, and I saw the shadow on the wall of the windowsill and Holmes' feet, about 6 inches above it. He remained in this position for a few seconds, then raised the window and glided into the room feet foremost, and sat. Adair's account of the central incident follows. We heard Home go into the next room, heard the window thrown up, and presently Home appeared standing upright outside our window. He opened the window and walked in quite coolly. I remarked that the window was not raised a foot and that I could not think how Home had managed to squeeze through. He arose and said, "Come with him." I went. He told me to open the window as it was before. I did, so he told me to stand a little distance off. He then went through the open space headfirst quite rapidly, his body being nearly horizontal and apparently rigid. He came in again, feet foremost, and we returned to the other room. It was so dark I could not see clearly how he was supported outside. He did not appear to grasp or rest upon the balustrade, but rather to be swung outside. Each window has a small balcony or ledge 19 inches deep bounded by stone balustrades 18 inches high. In July, 1869, Lord Lindsay gave an account of the incident to the Committee of the Dialectical Society, which runs as follows. I saw the levitations in Victoria Street when Home floated out of the window. He first went into a trance and walked about uneasily. He then went into the hall. While he was away, I heard a voice whisper in my ear. He will go out of one window and in at another. I was alarmed and shocked at the idea of so dangerous an experiment. I told the company what I had heard, and we then waited for Holmes' return. Shortly after he entered the room, I heard the window go up, but I could not see it for I sat with my back to it. Yet I saw his shadow on the opposite wall. He went out of the window in a horizontal position and I saw him outside the other window. It was 85 feet from the ground. It will be seen that both Lindsay's accounts suggest without expressly stating that Home floated outside the window in a horizontal position, whereas Lord Adair states that Home stood upright. Lord Lindsay had at an earlier period of the evening, seen an apparition of a man sitting in a chair. One of the spirits before the performance had announced what it was proposed to do, and that on a previous occasion, a few days before in presence of two of the same witnesses Home had opened the same window, stepped on the ledge outside and remained standing there to the great alarm of Lord Lindsay looking down at the street, some 80 feet below. The medium had thus furnished a rough sketch of the picture, which he aimed at producing whatever the nature of the complex illusion. However, whether of sense or of memory or it seems likely of both. It is certain that it was shared in the retrospect by all the three persons present. Actually, the collective part of the illusion is seen in analysis to have been of a comparatively unimpressive kind from Lord Lindsay's account, the most detailed record, which we have of the actual levitation. It would seem that probably after having announced that the spirits were about to carry him through the air from one window to another, Home left the room, a sound was heard which suggested the opening of the window in the next room. Shortly afterwards, Lord Lindsay, who had his back to the window, saw in the opposite wall a shadow thrown by the faint moon. This suggested to him that Home was outside the window, and he appears to have accepted the assurance of the spirits that in fact the medium had been conveyed to that point through the air from the window ledge of the adjoining room, remembering that the room was lighted only by a moon, 2 days old. Then while the evidence at present must be held insufficient to substantiate the preternatural power over material nature claimed for Home and other mediums, it seems possible that the marvels reported were, in some cases, something more than mere conjuring. At a conjuring performance, the spectator's judgment is fooled, but his actual perceptions are probably unimpaired. There is fallacy, but it is of inference and interpretation, not of the senses. In the performances, especially of Home, there appears at times to have been an actual sense deception of the type commonly known as illusion rather than hallucination. It is a sense deception in which the foundation is laid by impressions received from the world. When Lord Lindsay and his friends saw Home levitated, their perceptive faculties were misled in much the same way as a spectator at a séance when he greets the medium dressed up in a white sheet and nightcap as his grandmother. The conditions, the subdued light, the emotional stress, and the expectancy of the sitters were propitious for sense deceptions of this kind. One other factor may also have contributed to the result. Witnesses no doubt assisted and encouraged each other in the erroneous interpretation of what they saw, each contributing some fresh item of confirmation or enlargement. It is a very strange thing that the origin of Home's miracles in broad daylight or artificial light could never be traced to fraud or indeed to any known cause. Those who witnessed his feats were sincere in giving credence to them. For the mind of the average person accepts what it sees and is not willing to apply the laws of physics, no matter how much or how glaringly the act defies the fundamental principles upon which our very existence depends.